it is, President's house, what's left of it, severed in half by an act of God such that it looks like two separate buildings. 10 years to construct, only a few moments to destroy. The home Mrs. Madison and I will never occupy again. I remember the day so clearly, August the 24th, 1814. Hazy, hot, humid, tensions running high, and frantic awareness heavy in the air as well as in our hearts. I began my day with a meeting of our commanders at the Navy Yard while Mrs. Madison waited at the President's house, and ended my day not knowing if she was safe. At the British approach, the pandemonium came to a fever pitch as everyone was fleeing the city pell-mell. We were off to the races all right, but it wasn't the horses that were running. Mrs. Madison sent her parrot here to the Octagon House while she had already gathered all our important documents and had them sent away to a secure location. She was adamant that she would wait until my return so we could leave the President's house together. We wouldn't be entertaining guests that night, at least not the ones we wanted. She waited to the moment of her peril to ensure Mr. Stewart's painting of His Excellency General George Washington, our first President, was safely evacuated. An act of courage that I hope our country will ever be grateful for. Then at 2 p.m., a series of bizarre events began to unfold. Perfectly still, an oppressive day gradually transformed into a vicious storm, the likes I may never see again. It started with clouds appearing blown in by a breeze. Thunder began to rumble in the distance until the clouds were so pregnant with rain it began to discharge its own weapon. What must have been thought an antidote to the soldiers' heat exhaustion turned into an attack of a different kind. The rain was not just water, but musket ball-like hail that pummeled anyone who could not find refuge. The wind was so blustery it became violent as well. Men could no longer stand against it, and cannon were lifted as if levitated by a mysterious power and set aside to rest elsewhere. But nay, this was not the end of this bizarre occasion. It had saved itself for a finale of the worst kind. A swirling cone of wind was spotted twirling and taking aim of its own. It clearly had a destination in mind, and I can only leave it to Providence to understand why insult was to be added to injury. Already smoldering from the British torch, the destination was to be our home. It tore through that burnt stone structure as if it was sand, leaving complete destruction in its wake. And thus you see the results before you. That sight, although difficult to behold, is our testament to our country's resolve. Embarking on our new Republican experiment has been like in a wilderness without a single footstep to guide us. And though war is always the last resort to conflict resolution, the momentum towards that war had been building for so many years. There comes a time to take a stand, even if we were not wholly prepared. I take responsibility for losing the federal city. I fear that some of my judgments and my appointments did not allow this war to be prosecuted with precision. 4,000 miles of boundaries simply turned out to be an overwhelming quantity of territory for our paltry forces to protect. I said to Ambassador William Pinckney 5 years ago that it was impossible not to see that the avowed object is no longer to retaliate on an enemy, but to prevent legitimate commerce. No, the war was necessary to protect our economy and secure and vindicate our independence. There was simply a panoply of issues that we could no longer tolerate. In order to prevent escalation of an already unhappy situation, a retrospective may reveal for posterity a trail of reason that led to my decision to request from Congress a declaration of war on June the 1st, 1812, which they granted on June the 18th of the same. Wanton impressment of our sailors on the high seas, beginning with the Chesapeake and Leonard incident already 7 years ago in 1807. The question of territory. Great Britain was not maintaining her commitment to evacuating the forts in our western parts, deemed her duty as part of the 1783 Treaty of Paris. Preventing the legal flow of trade. Approved in 1805 when Mrs. Madison was ill, and I was by her side in Philadelphia, authoring my longest work to date to prove the rule of 1756 illegal according to international law. It was for naught. Great Britain continued to ignore its consequences, so President Jefferson and I implemented an embargo in 1807. It failed, as Mr. Gallatin said it would, but still we wanted to work as a civilized alternative to bloodshed, so we modified it in 1809 to stipulate that trade limitations would only be imposed on the principals in the affair, Great Britain and France. But some of our northern states became mercenary in their pursuits to maintain their livelihood. We were backward stepping slowly into a corner that left us no alternative but to bare our teeth. So when the Russians offered to mediate between us and Great Britain last year, I grasped at the offer, even should it prove a nettle. I sent Mr. Gallatin, born himself in Geneva and accustomed to the trickeries of European diplomacy, to join with Mr. Quincy Adams, our most experienced diplomatist, in St. Petersburg at the Imperial Russian Court, there to treat, we hoped, with England, and bring an end to a war that benefited neither of us. We could not make an impression with this effort, so the war was forced to rage on, until we secured a most glorious victory on September 11th of this year. There is a bright and shining moment to celebrate. The reports I received of the strategic land and naval victories at Plattsburgh, New York, under General McComb and Commodore McDonough, should think our report will embolden our negotiating stance in Ghent to be a most persuasive bargaining chip in forcing this war to come to a speedy and resolute conclusion.